Thy will be done. That's the main message of the teaching, really. Not my will, but God's will. Everything is a happening according to God's will, down to the time that a leaf falls off a tree and the path that it takes to get to the ground. The thoughts that arise in each moment arise exactly according to thy will, not my will. The actions that follow the thoughts are thy will, God's will, not my will. The outcomes of those actions, all part of God's will. The feeling of hunger that might arise arises according to God's will. The emotions that we might have towards a person in relation to a certain circumstance or situation that's happening, all of that is God's will unfolding. Nothing happens unless it's God's will. All there is God's will. God and God's will are not two things. All there is God. That's non-duality, not two. Just God. And it is the separation, which is essentially the attitude, the view, the belief, the way of seeing life as me and the other, as separate entities that are not part of the unfolding of God's will. It is the attitude that doesn't see everything as God's will that we can call the attitude of dualism, and that we can call the attitude of separation. And that attitude of separation and dualism leads to all of the psychological suffering, the uncomfortableness that we experience as part of our life experience. Now, the suffering is not pain. I'm not referring to pain or tragic circumstance, but rather the attitude towards the circumstance. And that attitude, which is often an attitude of resistance, of things should be different, includes in it a sense of, or an idea of me. They should be different because this is not good for me. They should be different because this means that I can't be complete. You hurt me. You did something that hurt me, so I hate you. So I hate you. That creates an uncomfortableness in the experience. And if that narrative, that attitude to whatever happens in each moment falls away, that is the end of suffering. And for that attitude to fall away, the notion of me and the other as doers of what is happening in life, as orchestrators, needs to dissolve. And it dissolves when it's appreciated that the speaking, the thinking, the feelings, the actions, the external movements of the other, the external movements of all the animate and inanimate objects in the world is just a happening, part of the creation, part of God's will. So this God's will doesn't imply a separate external God that is looking in, having fun, seeing all of the humans struggling. That would be another idea of dualism, another attitude of dualism. God and his separate creation. But rather, God is consciousness. God at rest is consciousness at rest, which means no manifestation, pure creative potentiality. And at some point, that pure creative potentiality explodes into manifestation. And what explodes into manifestation means explodes into a creative story. The unmanifest becomes the manifest. Consciousness creates within it an experience of form. So the formless appears to become form by creating the experience of form, the experience of manifestation within it. It becomes essentially not separate from the manifestation. So the consciousness is not out there looking in, but it is experiencing the world from the perspective of Roger and John and Mary and all of the conscious animals or animate sentient beings. The aware beings, i.e. those animals that have consciousness, are the instruments through which consciousness moves, and the instrument through which consciousness or God is aware of the creation that it has become. If an appreciation of the fact that the thinking isn't done by anybody, there is no thinker, there is no entity that is separate from the thinking. There is no chooser of the thoughts. If it becomes apparent that the thoughts come out in a specific moment, they spontaneously appear. And if we look at it on a simple causality basis, we see that the thoughts come out of a machine that has been programmed by life, has been determined by life, by God, as part of God's will. So the thoughts, which we often say are my thoughts, are happening. And so if that gets appreciated on a deep level, so much of the criticism, judgment, wanting life to be different, thinking it should be different, it could be different, will fall away. It simply cannot exist with a deep appreciation that each moment is a happening according to God's will. Now, often as a means of defending against this notion of non-duality, against a way of defending against the way that we are not the doers, the intellect will come up and say, well, God wouldn't produce all of these terrible things because of a particular notion of God that we might have. And also because of our relationship to life and the things that happen in life that make them personal all the way down to the depth of who we are. And so from that point of view, when the experience is that way, then this notion that everything that happens in life is God's will just doesn't make sense. It's like, no, what sort of God would create evil? What sort of God would sanction the huge variety that we have in life? If we start looking at this particular manifestation, this particular creation, not as a creation that has to be according to our preference, and our preference is all pleasure, all good, all the way I would like it. If we look at the manifestation free of that notion, which can be hard to do because we're so invested in life one day turning out to be perfect. But if we can objectively stand back and say, hey, what if this creation is not in its nature a creation of pleasure, 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 pleasure? The artist, the master, has created a masterpiece that in practice is a creation of duality. Now notice the difference between the word dualism and duality. So earlier on I said when you see everything as separate, and in particular see me and the other as the doers and not as God's will, that is the attitude that there is me and the other and we are the orchestrators of life. And that is what you could call the attitude of dualism. The nature of life being, on an experience level, an experience of duality is different to the attitude of dualism. What an experience of duality refers to is an experience that includes interconnected opposites. Good and bad, wealth and poverty, health and disease, male and female, north and south. So they don't have to be good and bad, they just have to be interconnected opposites. East and west, hot and cold. And those interconnected opposites are really two ends of one thing. Just like the yin-yang symbol that is made up of black and white, and yet the black and the white are not separate. They are the yin-yang symbol. However, in experience, there is black and there is white. There is a distinction between the two. And so if we appreciate this manifestation, this creation, this experience was designed to be an experience of duality. God or source has turned into the experience of duality. So this manifestation is not necessarily meant to be an experience of all pleasure. Just like in our life, there are artists, movie makers that will create horror movies, and then there are comedies and dramas and action movies. And so the horror is a valid creative expression. So life is really a drama. If we have an attitude towards the drama, which is an attitude that appreciates that the experience of life is meant to be exactly as it is in each moment. And that doesn't mean that change won't happen in the next moment. The very nature of life is also change. And so in the next moment, seeing it if we see life in this moment as it being exactly the way it's meant to be, doesn't mean that in the next moment it isn't going to change radically. All of the forms of suffering, when we look at them, and it's important to know what those forms of suffering are: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, which have their subsets underneath all of those: anxiety, despair, lack of self-worth, hatred, resentment, judgment, fear. All of those forms of suffering are essentially expressions of the identity of dualism. The identity of dualism is essentially an attitudinal identity. It is an attitudinal entity, a conceptual entity, an entity that doesn't really exist except as thought, but that thought has become so, or the entity has become so deeply ingrained that the thought that looks at life and has an opinion and a feeling about what that means to me is very consistent because of this deeply ingrainedness. And because it is consistently there, it feels like that is what I am, and it feels like it's very real. And the suffering is said to be unreal and can fall away in an instant because the suffering is an expression of a psychological self that is really a conceptual self. And at any moment, that conceptual self can be affected, can be changed, can collapse. And the conceptual self is the idea I am the doer and I need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. I need outcomes, pleasurable outcomes, in order for me to one day feel complete, to one day be at peace with life, to one day feel content. That is a belief about what life is, about who I am and what I need. And it covers up a deeper experience of self that, when it is grounded into, is self-fulfilling and self-contenting, which really means there is immediate feedback that says, I exist right now, whole and free of suffering. So the very connection is a connection that confirms that everything is okay as it is. It is an intimacy with oneself where that self, the deeper self that is often covered up, reveals itself to be fine with life as it is, to be in harmony with life as it is. So it can be useful to keep in mind that suffering is not our true nature. Suffering is a result of the psychological or conceptual self that started forming as soon as the intellect started receiving sensory input. And then the intellect started to, in itself, develop such that language was formed, and an experience of the world, moment after moment, day after day, started giving sensory feedback that forced certain intellectual conclusions about what life is and what we need, what we like, what we don't like. And as that development happened, including all of the ideas that started to get formed from a very young age about who we are and what we need, that covered up the deeper sense of self. And so what we really are is different from what has been put in place and how we therefore experience ourselves. So suffering is not our true nature. Suffering is a result of an entity that formed at a very young age as part of the very ordinary and normal development of life, development of a human being growing in life. So whenever there is uncomfortableness, it can be helpful for us to understand, yes, it is here. It must be part of the creation, and yet it is not my true nature. Some movement is happening in this moment as part of God's will that is obscuring the true nature which is self-contenting, self-fulfilled, and free of suffering. And that movement is usually the movement of the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is based on the notion, I am the doer, which means it is not all God's will. And my happiness is to be found not in my very own nature, but rather in the acquisition of things out there. That would be the movement that would be happening either on a conscious level or in the background on an unconscious level whenever suffering is present. And suffering really means an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, a feeling that things are not okay as they are. So it can be very helpful to remember suffering is not my true nature. It can be a catalyst to inspire an investigation as to what particularly is going on in this moment. The hint is that what would be going on is a psychological movement of the thinking mind. And that psychological movement of the thinking mind at its root has the notion, the belief, I am the doer, the other is the doer. So you hurt me, you delivered pain, you hurt me. You chose to do that as a separate, independent entity, the one that is got volitional control over everything that they think, say, and do. And because you chose to deliver pain to me, I have to hate you like an enemy. You are an enemy if you're delivering pain to me. That is the attitude of dualism. That's the attitude of the me that sees life not as God's will. So it's an invitation whenever there is an uncomfortableness to, if it resonates, that is not the true nature, but rather something that has set in place as part of this particular story of life. It is an invitation to see if in that moment it is God's will for an inquiry to happen into what particularly the suffering is. And remember, it's always going to be an attitude of doership and attachment to the particular circumstance. And that attitude is always essentially invalidated if we come back to this is God's will. Everything is God's will. Life is like a block from the beginning of time to the end of time. And it was created in an instant. God became that block. And the block unfolds. And what we're aware of is the unfolding story, one segment at a time, as if looking through a window, seeing the block one moment at a time. And it appears to be that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. But if it's a block that was created in an instant, then A exists and B exists and C exists and D exists. And so as well as A leading to B, leading to C, leading to D, we can see that D leads to C, leads to B, leads to A. And A is independent of B, is independent of C, is independent of D. So any narrative of this happened because of this, if only I didn't do that, I should have done it differently, this outcome is not how things should be. All of that narrative is supported by the absence of the notion everything is a spontaneous happening according to God's will. It seems like this story of life is a story of consciousness identifying and functioning through a body-mind organism and forgetting itself, becoming identified with the appearance of life, with the body, and seeing the body as a separate, independent entity. So that is the forgetting of who one really is, and that creates suffering. So it is a story of forgetting, a story of suffering, a story of suffering because of the varied circumstance that we can call our destiny, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And it appears to be a story that at some point leads to a questioning about life, and if it's destiny, an awakening or a remembering who we really are, a connection to a deeper part of ourself. And that leads to the end of suffering. And the end of suffering really heavily equates to a turning inward, not only to find the deep part of ourself and be that, something that doesn't tend to happen when we are looking out at circumstance, looking back at the past and looking forward into the future, complaining about the present. So turning inwards really means that the thinking mind, and to some extent for a while the working mind also, needs to be cut off essentially by looking into the inner landscape. That when there is a looking in the inner landscape with a clarity that sees that so many of the thoughts that pop up when looking inward are bringing the external world in, or bringing a memory of an external world in, which really means there isn't so much capacity to experience the inner landscape. When that is seen and the background becomes more visible, because those objects about the past, about a world outside, are seen to just be thoughts arising in the internal landscape. And when it's recognized how powerful those thoughts about the external world are. So I'm talking in a way here about what might happen in a closed eye meditation. If it becomes appreciated that thoughts about time and space, about causality, about the body, about the other, about the past, about the future, they bring that world in, and they and that world, which is not the inner landscape, essentially covers up the inner landscape. It brings the outer world inside, which means the inner landscape is not able to be known or appreciated. So as those objects of thought are seen to be exactly that, objects arising that have a very strong power on the internal landscape, they may actually start to subside, and a seeing beyond the form that the thought creates can happen. All of that, if it happens, is also part of God's will. So turning inward is very important, not only for us to be able to ground into a deeper part of ourselves, to be that, but to become less concerned, less interested in so many of the things that are happening out there. And when we become much less concerned about what is happening out there, much less concerned about what other people are thinking, what other people are doing with their life, because we understand that there is going to be this huge variety out there, and that it's not really that relevant to who I am, then there is a silencing of a whole lot of thinking that was forced to happen when we were looking outward. Now, it might sound like being less interested in what is out there is a selfishness, or it will lead to a lack of contribution. But in practice, a withdrawing in the way that I'm suggesting doesn't lead to a lack of contribution, because so much of our investment in what is happening out there is not really contributing anything meaningful, but rather is judging and is thinking about circumstance and not doing much about it. And so when there is less interest in what is out there, what we find is there's a silence and a space that opens up, because literally 90% of the thinking, 100% of the uncomfortable thinking falls away. There's a space. And when something in your actual experience right in front of you exists, then there is a capacity to contribute, to do what you can in that particular moment, rather than thinking about big picture topics that we actually are not going to be able to meaningfully affect. So an example of that, instead of worrying about world hunger, see what you can do for a hungry person that you might come across on the street. knowing that you can't do everything for everyone you come across on the street. And if you're not interested in world hunger, then you may not even be interested in doing something for someone you come across on the street. This is not saying that we should all act a particular way. In fact, an appreciation that everything is happening according to God's will means that if you find yourself one day walking past someone who is asking for something on the street, the thought might arise, not today, my friend. You may not say anything, but a thought, a feeling might arise that leads to no action. And that is as valid in terms of the unfolding of the story of life, as valid in principle as an action of maybe being generous in a moment and giving someone $20. Both actions are the unfolding of God's will. The important point to take away here is that if we see everything as God's will, if we turn inward and become less involved in what is out there in terms of the bigger picture, that doesn't make us impotent in terms of affecting change and contributing. We become potent because we will act in situations where we can do something, knowing that the outcome is not in our control. You may feel generous one day and give something to someone, and that may turn out to be not as beneficial as you might have thought or might have hoped. The outcome is also part of God's will. It is what it is. A lot of people will say that, even if they're not necessarily exposed to non-dual teachings. And I would hazard a guess that when someone says it is what it is, that is stemming from a realization that resisting and judging and wanting things to be different leads to an uncomfortableness in life that just simply is not sustainable. And after long enough, the ignorance, the misunderstanding in judging things as right or wrong, as should be this way and not that way, gets seen. So in these times in particular, where there are sustained periods where large portions of the population are quite divided as to the current economic situation, health situation, what the right course of action is. Because there is such a divide, there is an extended period of time when things aren't going to be turning out the way you would like, where people have different perspectives to you and different ways of thinking about things. And so if the old attitude, which is bound to be there, or the current attitude of doership and judgment, or doership and attachment, which leads to a lot of judgment, etc. If that's there, in situations like this, where the the circumstance is extended in time, many people will start to see that I have to just shut up. My internal commentary and judgment needs to shut up because it is delivering my own uncomfortableness. It is like an internal factory producing internal uncomfortableness that is polluting our momentary experience of life. And once that's recognized, that it is our attitude to what is inevitably happening that causes all of the resentment to others, all of the doubt and uncertainty towards ourselves, all of the wondering what the future will be like, regrets about the past and complaining about the present. When we recognize that, then we start saying, it's from our own insight, it is what it is, which is saying, I'm not going to get involved in it. And it's not saying it from a place of complacency. It's saying it from a place of realizing what the suffering really is and seeing the inevitability of things like diversity of opinion, because there are 8 billion people in life, all with different perspectives, all with different preferences, all with different life scenarios. And so attitude of trying to essentially control everyone and insist that everyone is homogenous, insists that everyone is like me and thinks the same way as me, is on my side, is seen at some time as being unrealistic, as being the very cause of our own suffering. And then this this thought, which is really wrapping all of that insight up, that says, it is what it is. No point getting too concerned about it. Another expression that some people tend to fall into and repeat, which represents the same insight, is, it's all good. It's all good. And that it's all good really is just a counter to the historic and the ingrained attitude that says that's not good. That shouldn't happen. So, if someone turns up late, an hour late for something, and they say, oh, look, I'm so sorry, I'm an hour late. And if someone started seeing life a certain way, they go, oh, it's all good. Because previously they know that they wouldn't have thought it was all good, which really means it is as it is. It means it's not something I'm going to take as being absolutely bad and therefore getting all invested in it. So from their own experience of having seen the old way and what it delivers, for example, getting angry at the fact that someone is late, that they haven't done what they said they were going to do, that they've affected your day, it's more of an attitude that says, it is what it is, which means, oh, I'm going to have the attitude that it's all as it should be. So we say, oh, it's all good. I remember at some point that was what kept coming up, and that's part of the understanding, going deeper and deeper. But I had an issue with it. I happened to be thinking of starving people in Africa. It was just an image that came up. I said, you can't really say it's all good. I knew what I meant, but because I, at different times, started to be very pedantic with language, because language really is part of our understanding, I said, well, it's all good isn't perfect. I felt like I wanted to refine it, because I thought, well, starving children is not good in an absolute sense, as in it on all levels. It's not good on all levels. So what we're saying is it is life as it is. There very clearly are starving people in the world, much less than historically, but there are starving people in the world. And so it's all good, or it is what it is, basically says, life is a big thing. It's happening. It's the unfolding of evolution, or it's the spontaneous creation of God. And it is that way. And so attitudinally, I'm not going to say it should be, it has to be different. So that's really what it's all good, or it is what it is, was saying. And on a relative level, we say, well, starving children is sad, it's tragic, it's painful. And so I decided I'd stop using "it's all good" and refined it to something that says it is. That's much less defining. It's saying, well, it is that way. And I'm not saying that it's good or bad, it just is. So God, in some of the stories, in the Bible stories, appeared to Moses as a burning bush. And when Moses asked, "Who are you?" the answer is, "I am that I am." It's very similar to "it is what it is." I am that I am. He didn't say I am God, or I am the all-powerful, or I am a burning bush. That sort of defines it too much. Language, a word or two, and we have a very limited definition of what that word means based on our own experience. And so if God said, "I am the all-powerful," or "I am the creator," or "I am a burning bush," it's too defining. It's not a good representation of just what is. So it is "I am that I am," which is really just saying, I am the truth. I am the actuality. It can't be put into words, can't be defined. I'm not this or that, but all of it, let's say. Or and it's not even saying I am some of it or I am all of it. See, if I go and say I am all of it, in a way that is the very error that I'm pointing at. So I am that I am. It is what it is. It just is. Now, this doesn't actually require any great spiritual experience or enlightening revelation for us to see, to stand back and see. I might not like the fact that there is pain in life. We're not going to like it on a preference level, because our preference is for pleasure. That's what preference is, a preference for pleasure, and a preference not to have those things that we don't like. Those things that we don't like are essentially pain. So it doesn't take any great spiritual revelation or spiritual peak experience for us to stand back and say, I might not like the fact that bad things happen or painful things happen, but they do. We see them everywhere we look. It doesn't take some great peak experience for us to realize people are going to let us down. Our best friends will let us down. We will let our best friends down sometimes, maybe, depending on destiny. And if someone lets us down, we realize, wow, if my makeup was slightly different, or if my history was different, if my attachment to outcomes was different to what it is, I would act differently to how I might act, and I could be you. So we start to appreciate that I might, because I want life to be one way, pleasure, 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 we tend to not acknowledge the fact that life is not one way. Life is this duality of pleasure and pain, that life is happening outside of our control. How can we possibly be in control of 8 billion people, let alone the animals and the trees and the objects that are governed by the laws of physics? It's impossible to be in control of the external world. There are just too many variables. And when we look at our own functioning, if we do put our attachment aside, which doesn't want to see any of what I'm talking about tonight, if we put it aside, we'll realize I'm not even in control of my bodily functions. They cooperate for a while and do what I want them to do sometimes. And for as long as they're doing that, then we say, oh, I'm in control. When they stop cooperating with my preference, that's when we realize we're not in control of our very own faculties. We're not in control of our actions or our thoughts or our emotions. They're often very much different to what we would like, what we would prefer. We're not in control of the outcomes. So even if our body and our thoughts operate in a way we like, we can see a certain enacting happening in life, and then the outcome can be something completely out of left field. Sometimes we get what we want. Sometimes we don't get what we want. And Ramesh used to say, and sometimes we get much more than what we want. So there isn't some huge revelation that has to happen. It's just that our attachment, our desperation for life to be the way we imagine, the way we idealize, our desperation for that prevents us from seeing the reality. And when we see the reality, it creates a surrender. When we don't see the reality, what we're completely obsessed with is trying to control life so that it is one way, the way we think it needs to be in order for us to feel more comfortable in life. The irony is that the uncomfortableness that we're trying to fix stems from that not seeing the truth of how it is. So when we're seeking truth, or when teachings are talking about truth, they do it for a good reason, because if we were to talk about peace of mind and the end of suffering, it's very easy for the attachment that wants pleasure, 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 and better things than it has to say, oh, that sounds wonderful. That's what I'm going to do. I am going to be a seeker that will get that. And it could be very well intentioned. However, if that old attitude of doership kicks in and grabs hold of the teachings as a way of saying, oh, thank you for telling me what I, as the doer, can make happen, which is what I need to happen because I see my happiness is to be found in the future and outcomes rather than in a connecting to a deeper part of myself. If that happens, then that in itself is going to be a strengthening of that psychological identity, a strengthening of the suffering. And so to mitigate that, the teaching often won't say it's about an outcome. it'll say nothing's really going to change. And it says what you're really interested in truth is just to know things as they really are, to know yourself, to no longer have a facade running that is lying or presenting an image to the external world, which is really a form of inauthenticity. So we're told we're looking for truth, and truth is very appealing because deep down, we sense that the psychological sense of me is an untruth, it's a mistake, it's an error. But more importantly, this seeking for truth, although we think it is about some absolute truth, is really a way of us seeing what really is. It's an encouragement for us to step away from what our craving and our sense of self has interpreted the world as. And it's saying, don't you want to just see life as it is? Let go of your personal investment in something and step back and see. You know, you might be, an example is you might be heavily invested in a business, and you just don't want to see that it was a bad investment. It's too painful to acknowledge it's a bad investment. It's not, it's going to keep going downhill. And if we're heavily invested in it, it's just too hard to step back and say, I've made a bad mistake and it's not going to turn out well. There will be for a while a kidding oneself, a hoping and not wanting to see the truth because it is too painful. It's too much of a challenge. At some point, the writing is on the wall and you can't hide from it anymore. And so seeking is a bit like that. It's when the suffering has got so intense that we're forced to say, hang on a second, am I going to continue to live my life ignoring what intuitively I know is there to be seen? And so just see things as they are, including the fact that so much of life, all of life, is out of our control. Even the things that seem like they're in control. So the fact that I can move my hand seemingly at will, that I can move an object from one side of the room to the other, even that is not proof that we're in control. It appears like we have control because it happened like we would, like the thought said was my intention. But at any moment, you could trip over, you could have a seizure, you could, the doorbell could ring, and things don't end up the way you expected. So we see that we only think we're in control when the outcomes turn out the way we intend, which might not be because we're actually in control. You can toss a coin and you can call heads, and heads can land. And if we think, oh, I called heads and heads landed, so I'm in control, we're drawing an incorrect conclusion. Because when you call heads and then tails come up, then you go, oh, in that case, I wasn't in control because I called heads and tails came up. So then you say, well, so does that mean I was in control when heads came up? Or was it just that it turned out the way I would like it to turn out? And the same with you putting 5 words together or 10, a sentence together. It doesn't take much to realize that if the brain stopped working in the way it is currently, even formulating a sentence or understanding something. I was visiting someone in a hospital recently, and I saw someone that was having a stroke after having an angiogram, a mild stroke, and it was a temporary one, fortunately. But so lots of doctors came around and were showing him pictures of sort of like kids color in pictures of people at a park or something, and asking him to describe what he saw. And I was looking at him while he was, and there was this inability to communicate, and that what he couldn't put what he was seeing into words. That part of the brain that would formulate an idea of what this is stopped working. And so a faculty that 10 minutes earlier or half an hour earlier he had stopped working. Not because he chose it to stop working, which shows we're not in control. Now, this might sound terrible news. It does sound like terrible news to the doer, to the psychological identity that is attached to outcomes, meaning believes that its happiness is to be found in outcomes. But if this seeing things as they are actually leads to a cutting off of so much of the judgment, so much of the resistance, so much of the seeking outwardly, realizing that's not where we're going to find happiness. Happiness is turning inward. And I've spent my life looking outward, looking back in the past with regrets, into the future with expectation, complaining about what's happening in the present. If an appreciation that life is what it is, it's unfolding, it's like an avalanche coming down a mountain, and we stop continually telling the avalanche to move a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, please, realizing it is a beast unto itself. It's a force that is moving it, and it will move exactly as those forces dictate. So if we start seeing that that is life, then instead of it being a terrible notion to the doer, what it can do is it can dissolve the doer. It can be the end. It can be the plug being pulled on continually reinforcing this idea of who I am as the one that validly says life should be different. So given I've been talking about shoulds in the last few minutes or so, for the whole of the satsang, a lot of what I've been pointing out is that our attitude to life is one of not being in harmony, but in a sense saying how life should be, how I should act, instead of realizing who am I to know how life created by not me should be. Maybe I should just say, actually, it just is what it is. It's like going into a gallery and seeing an art piece and saying, oh, I think he should have done this and this and this. Instead of just looking at it and said, well, what he has done is this. And it is what it is. And it's not for me to say it should be different. So with this understanding, a lot of our deeply ingrained attitudes of doership that take the form of, oh, I should act this way, I should live my life this way, I shouldn't do that. They are all part of the psychological me, the shoulds and shouldn'ts. A whole list of shoulds and shouldn'ts. A list that we project onto other people, that keeps the thinking mind constantly having something to do to judge the world. And it keeps us often in a certain pattern of how to live life, always saying yes, maybe because I should say yes, because if I say no, they will be angry with me or they won't love me. Or I should work at this job because I, studied what I studied because my parents said that that was very important. I should have these values because that's what society says, or what I have determined is where my happiness is going to be. And at some point we realize all of these shoulds and shouldn'ts are like telling God how the world needs to be. And so we say, if I drop all of my shoulds and shouldn'ts, how would I live? And what we might find is that we will start to see a more spontaneous movement, a more real movement, a less constricted movement, something that feels much more authentic. So in practice, it's all well and good to sort of see and understand about life as a happening, as God's will, as it is the way it is. And yet if in practice we are then judging and applying a whole lot of restrictive attitudes that say life has to be this way, I have to live my life this way, you have to live your life that way, then there's a conflict. There's where the theoretical understanding or the intellectual understanding isn't translating into a practical understanding. And that connection often isn't appreciated. It isn't seen that if in practice I continue to judge, I continue to feel resentment, I continue to feel shame, I continue to have expectations about the future, I continue to say how my life should and shouldn't be, then essentially what is happening is that what we might think we understand deeply isn't that deeply understood, because in practice we are reverting back to life has to be this way. I know what God's will is what we say. And so if we start rubbing those habits out, if that means if attention lands on them, which is all part of the unfolding of life, destiny, if attention lands on certain habits, then there's a capacity to do something different, to find a functioning, a happening that is different. And that essentially is uprooting the deeply ingrained remaining belief of doership that is manifesting as, for example, this is how I have to live my life. I can't possibly do it differently because that would be wrong. It means there's no surrender to the diversity of how the next moment could unfold. So the next intensive, there's been quite a few of you have participated in the first two, which is great to see. They are a little different. The intensives are 6 satsangs strung together on a particular topic, and so there's a bit more of a progression that happens in them. The next one is on shoulds and shouldn'ts, which is really about how we start living differently by adjusting some of the very small things at first. Seeing the ideas that keep us living out of a fear of attachment to outcomes, especially a fear of not being appreciated by the others, a fear of doing what we think the others want us to do. And there's a great freedom in being able to say no. Being able to say, actually, I'm not going to go out every Friday night or every night of the week just because I get invitations. to be able to not answer an email if you don't feel like it, instead of saying, oh, it's been 3 hours since that email comes in, I should answer it. To not necessarily have to do the dishes every day at 7 a.m. before going to work because I should do the dishes before I go to work. And next week, I'll probably tell you a story about the day I decided to unplug my alarm clock. But that's for another time. Anyway, the theme of today's satsang was really, thy will be done. It's God's will, not your will, not my will. Everything is happening, unfolding. And if our seeing of that starts to happen, it really means the seeing moves back and we become the observer of what's happening instead of, or the witness of what's happening, instead of the one lost in the activity. There's much more space in witnessing. It's a bit like being in a conversation and not being the one talking, but rather, if you're in a group, being the one that sits back and listens. You get a bigger picture perspective. And as soon as you become the talker and are dragged into the position of the talker, maybe talking to one particular person, the perspective is lost, and you tend to become lost in that particular position, inside the circumstance. Thoughts arise in a body-mind organism. Feelings arise in a body-mind organism. Actions happen through a body-mind organism. Speaking is happening. You might appreciate that a thought only happens because something was seen, heard, smelt, tasted, or touched. This is the exercise that Ramesh used to suggest. If someone wants to see how we're not the doer, he'd say at the end of the day or whenever it suits you, sit quietly. You don't have to take up any meditation position or anything. He'd suggest if you want to have a beer or a sherry or a cup of coffee, you can bring that in with you. He'd suggest something like be in a closed room, turn off your phone, and then take any event of the day, take the one that you are convinced was your doing and investigate it. And upon investigation, you'll see that there was a circumstance happening, and that circumstance was not something you were in control of. It's much bigger than you. So the circumstance was there. You were there as part of the circumstance. And we saw something, we heard something, we tasted something, we touched something, or we smelt something. Something in the external world that we weren't in control of. And as we saw, heard, tasted, touched, smelt that, which we didn't know we were going to see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, as that came into our awareness, it then created a subsequent maybe thought arise about, oh, that's the smell of burn. Where is the burn coming from? And that thought, where is the burn coming from, inspires a movement to walk into some of the rooms of the house to see where the smell of burn is coming from. And then let's say you walk into a room and you see that the waste paper basket is on fire. So once again, a circumstance, a continuation, but even here we can investigate. Once again, there is a circumstance happening. You weren't in control of the circumstance. You saw something, you smelled something, and that inspired the movement. So you see the fire in the bin, and you look around the room and there's a towel, and you get a towel and you throw the towel over the bin. Maybe some adrenaline pumps through the body, or some anxiety, some fear. Maybe it's a moment of clarity and stillness and says, okay, the towel, starve it of oxygen. And that, we start off saying that was my doing. I was the one that put the towel over the bin. When we look at the situation, we see it started off because we were in a situation, and in this case, we smelt something. Had we not smelt it, we wouldn't have investigated. Had we not investigated, we wouldn't have seen the fire. Had we not seen the fire, we wouldn't have thought about what should I do. Had my conditioning been different, instead of thinking about what I should do and coming up with a good answer, there might have been panic, for example. Now, that doesn't mean that panic is not good or not a valid movement, and acting in a calculated manner is. Obviously, one is better than the other relative to a particular objective of, let's say, putting the fire out. But we have to appreciate in this investigation, if I was a particular way, the action would have been in line with that makeup. So if I was different and fear or panic came over me, the outcome might not have been the towel going on the bin, but maybe the body running out of the house and then the house burning down. And so that action, I did that on investigation, is a happening according to so many factors, none of which are in your control. And that investigation can be carried out time and time again. And each time we'll come up with, I'm not the doer. I simply cannot be the doer. Might be an insight at some point when it's been investigated. And each time, even our thinking, which clearly is a result of our makeup and the circumstance we're in, based on and what inputs come in, creates thoughts, creates feelings. And at some point when we've investigated and this principle becomes deeply understood, there is a revelation, an insight, an aha moment. I simply cannot be the doer. No one is the doer. No one has ever been the doer. I have never been the doer. Everything is a happening. So let's see if anyone has any questions. If you do, just put your hand up and we'll see if we get to you. Okay.
Hey, Roger.
Hey, Roger.
So recently, some experience triggered some suffering, and it had been a while since it had happened. So at first, there was a lot of resistance to it. And then, the next day I was like reflecting on it, and I realized that the resistance was coming from the idea that I need the suffering to go away in order to be happy, and actually resisting it wasn't going to improve the situation. So I can kind of see how going forward, it might be futile to resist the suffering, but it still doesn't give me clarity on how to respond to the suffering, because at the same time, it is still uncomfortable, which is why it's called suffering. So,
yeah.
So, whether it's through like witnessing or allowing the emotion to expand. Like these responses have come up in the past, and it seems like, over time, like the situation has improved. But I'm not sure how those responses actually reduce the suffering, and what's to say like it's even having an effect, and in the future it won't come back with the same intensity. So how do you like
Mhm.
actually know you're making any progress on it?
Well, the progress is simply by seeing the response to the suffering um, such that it in itself isn't adding more suffering. And eventually, we know that it's going even deeper, because the primary suffering that we previously had a response to of more suffering, that at some point stopped being a response of more suffering, but then at some point the primary suffering maybe even starts to get weaker or less prevalent, less frequent, gets cut off quicker. So the proof is always in the pudding. The teaching says that the practical manifestation of the deep understanding and realization is less suffering. Now, that's one explanation of how do we know, or that's an answer to the question, how do we know if things are changing or if there's a benefit? And my answer is, well, it all comes down to suffering and peace of mind. But that doesn't mean that what I'm saying is this is how you have to act, right? Or how you have to respond to suffering, because the very response that happens, whether it is one of adding more suffering onto the suffering, or whether it is a response of having seen that to be futile and therefore not resisting the suffering, whichever of those happens is not Akshay doing it, but rather is Akshay having been changed by life, including, let's say, whatever you found yourself exposed to, these teachings or these teachings and other teachings, speaking to a friend, whatever, everything that came before, including probably the latest, because that's the latest new conditioning that brings about a change to the up-to-date conditioning, has led to, let's say, less suffering. And so that we often say, oh, what I did is stopped getting involved in the suffering. The truth is that happened because life changed you such that started to happen. It wasn't so much the free will and volition of Akshay, but rather life affecting change such that particular change happened. Now, as you pointed out, suffering is suffering. It's very uncomfortable. It's the very nature of suffering is an uncomfortableness with self. And so it's very often the case that if the suffering has a certain intensity to it, there is no capacity to find that, or there is not capacity. Capacity implies doership. But what we're saying is, if the suffering is strong enough, a witnessing simply isn't what is going to happen. What is going to happen is a resistance to the suffering if it is intense enough. When we find a witnessing does happen and there is a witnessing of suffering, what it means is the intensity has changed. The intensity of the suffering has changed. Not necessarily the primary suffering, but the overall suffering of the system. So to the extent that there is a witnessing of the primary suffering and a not getting involved in it, it really means that the two situations are intrinsically different. One has much more suffering in it than the other. Not only because one doesn't have the suffering, the extra layer of suffering, the resistance to the suffering, but rather the resistance to the suffering doesn't happen because the intensity of the suffering is less. So you're right in saying, you know, sometimes there can't be witnessing. And that's exactly right, because it isn't that someone does it, it's just a consequence in a sense. So if there's a very hot fire and you put a piece of paper next to the very hot fire, the paper will burn if the fire is hot enough. If, on the other hand, you put the fire next to put the paper next to the fire, but the fire is less hot, it might not be hot enough to burn the paper. And so it's just a consequence of the particular makeup, the particular characteristics of the situation as to whether involvement happens or it doesn't happen. So I would suggest it's just about continuing to, well, it's really destiny unfolding, but if some, as new conditioning, I'd say really the exposure to the concepts is what brings about the change, or at least exposure to concepts is one way in which the change can be affected. And that's really all that needs to be done. And even that isn't your doing. It's just what you feel inspired to do. Let's say today you feel inspired to listen to the satsang. And that's enough. If that's the case, it means our destiny has inspired a movement to listen to the satsang. The satsang is delivering new conditioning that can change the up-to-date conditioning. All of that is part of God's will. I'm not in control of what I say. You're not in control of how what I say lands on your end. And the fact that I'm not in control and you're not in control doesn't really matter, because it's still going to happen. And then tomorrow, a thinking about maybe this conversation may or may not happen, not in our control. And so that is the progression of it. And as a result, including the fact that you saw your suffering some time ago and saw that getting involved in it was just more suffering, all of that is new conditioning as well. So next time that the suffering comes up, there will be a response to it. What the response is a mystery. You'll only know the response once it happens. And the likelihood is that as awareness and the intellect, the working mind, part of the intellect, become informed about these nuances, about these dynamics that are not normally spoken about, that is the change. And so next time, the response will be one way. It'll be a mystery to you until the response happens. And it wouldn't surprise me that over time, the intensity of the suffering, the involvement in the primary suffering, and in fact, the primary suffering itself will all start to reduce.
Yeah, and it definitely has. And, you know, to be honest, like one of the, in this instance, the suffering was, it was like grief from the need for love. And like for a while I'd been thinking, like all these other things, like, they kind of dropped away. And I was like, is it really true? Like, Roger and like others say that experience can't give you happiness, but like this felt so persistent. And it was like, well, maybe everything except for this. And then like, I was just thinking about it. I came across one of your other videos, and like, and also like a recent experience kind of triggered it, which kind of caused me to go down this path. So, and like I'm slowly starting to see that it was a story. And like it's crazy because like, as you said, like new conditioning and like kind of reflecting on it can have a change. Because like if you'd asked me like a few weeks earlier, I would have still been heavily involved in that story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you start seeing these things for yourself, like you're describing, that's very powerful. Especially seeing it in action in your own life experience. So, that's an important part of the teaching. It says these concepts are not just intellectual concepts that need to be handed over and that's it. They are pointers for you to hopefully start seeing in your own life experience, so that they then become your knowing, rather than just some amorphous concept talking about something that has no frame of reference in your life. Once you start seeing for yourself, yes, my suffering is in the attitude to the circumstance, and you really put a tick next to it when you are suffering and you see it, then that's the understanding going much deeper, and the suffering continuing in its old way just simply can't happen, because you are different. You have seen something and understood it deeply, and it might not be understood the first time you see it in your own life, but as you see it time and time again, which you will, because in principle it's always the same. So once you've seen it once, you'll then see it a second time and a third time. At some point you realize, you say, each time the circumstance is different, but I see that it's a particular attitude to the circumstance that is really causing the suffering. And that can be hard to see, because it's an attitude about or towards the circumstance. So, if someone steals something from you and someone asks you, what are you so uncomfortable about? Why is all this hatred there, for example? And you'd say, because he stole, I don't know, my phone. And so because it's an attitude towards the circumstance, it seems like it is because of the circumstance. But you can imagine in another person, if the stone, or in you, if things were very different, let's say, someone could steal the phone and your attitude could be, these things happen. It makes complete sense that someone saw my phone that happens to be 2 weeks old. It's the latest model. You can appreciate, yep, people don't have very much. They might not have any means of getting these things. They see other people with them, and the urge to steal what doesn't belong to them comes up. So if someone has that insight, then the circumstance is exactly the same. The pain is the same, in the sense that circumstantially, in either situation, you don't have the mobile phone, you have financial pain because you'll have to buy another one. And yet the attitude can be very different. One can create a whole lot of resistance to the fact that the phone has been stolen, a whole lot of hatred towards the person, a whole lot of shame towards yourself for having left it on the table while you were talking to someone and not looking. And we think that all of that shame and that blame is about the fact someone has stolen the phone, or is because someone has stolen the phone, whereas it's our attitude to the fact someone has stolen the phone. And that can get seen where someone else might say, it is what it is. So we start to see it's in the attitude, not in the circumstance. The circumstance is going to have its pain component. The suffering is something, additional.
Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay. Hello, Valdor. I can't hear you at the moment. Have you got yourself unmuted?
Is that better?
Yes, now I can hear you.
I'm sorry. Non-doership. I've been listening to you for a while, and I know Lisa also. I've been to 2 retreats with Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also with in another teaching, and if that is important. Non-doership and suffering. While you talked, a lot of was happening in me. Like you came to almost answer some questions which I was having in my mind. And yeah, the body, guilt. I see that lots of suffering is related to, let's see, traumas, like my parents wanting to please my mom, or someone else wanting to please my father, like being strong, being weak, being appreciated. And I project to my teachers too, and like if I'm in a group and we follow some teaching, relationship and wanting to be a good student. There is, for example, a situation in my work on Monday, and I want to perform well, and it's also a meeting of expectation, and lots of those issues have feel in the body someplace, like and lots of that is it's even related to sexuality, and it's like very low in the body. That can create some kind of guilt, similar to that was happening in childhood. And I couldn't say that I came far with this non-doership, because it's a dynamic process, and it's happening in the body, and seeing that I'm not the doer and it's just happening, it has to be, where to put it, like because if I'm related to my body, fear arises, and sensations arises, and this attitude of non-suffering and letting go, I'm not very good at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. What you're saying makes sense, because if we try to make ourselves have an attitude of non-doership, that in itself is doership, right? It's like saying, okay, I've been told that the attitude of doership causes suffering, so let me now use my doership to change my attitude. And that really isn't the message. The message is saying we have an attitude of doership, and that attitude of doership is God's will. It's something that was put in place, as you said, by historical events, traumas, ways we were brought up, expectations of parents, and then how those expectations came about inside of us, and what it made us, how it made us act. So all of those things that happened in the past, if they were different, we would have responded differently, we would have turned out differently. So all of those components are contributors to the attitude that we have, the attitude of doership, which is the standard human condition. And so we're saying that attitude of doership wasn't your doing. The attitude of doership is just what is there, how we are. And so we can't just magically say, oh, I want to change it, because once again, that would be, you are the doer. So we're saying the attitude of doership is there, but it's not a prescription to say you change it. It's just a description of what is. So the description is what is the attitude of doership. The attitude of doership does lead to suffering. So just a description. Then another description says, it is possible for that attitude of doership to change. And if it changes, there will be less suffering. But we keep saying, but you don't make it change. Life brings about the change. And life can bring about that change gradually and slowly. It often does bring it about gradually and slowly. And so if we are hearing about non-doership, when in fact the internal structure has very intense doership, it can just get frustrating, because the internal structure is very strongly bound and tightly wound, such that it creates the entity that has the belief of doership. And then we hear all this talk about non-doership and the end of suffering. It doesn't match our experience. In fact, we then don't want our experience, our current experience. We resist it more because we say that's not what is ideal. What I would like is the much better sounding version, the non-doership, and then it creates frustration. So that message is maybe only useful when there are certain openings, certain receptivity. That's not to say that it's not making a difference. I think that even just understanding it intellectually will play in with many other parts that are happening in your seeking. But in particular, one of the things you mentioned is about feelings in the body and traumas and things like that. So I think that it's very appropriate for you to put the concepts aside, the concepts of non-doership aside. Still, you know them, you've heard them, but you don't have to hold on to them too tightly. I would suggest that you continue to explore what is in the body, the deeply ingrained feelings, the traumas, and allow them to, if possible, because once I say allow, it sounds like I'm telling you to do it, but it's just a suggestion of how things might happen. There might be an allowance for the feelings of uncomfortableness to arise more than was there historically. Historically, feelings of uncomfortableness come up, and we find any defense to keep them suppressed. And keeping them suppressed seems like a good idea, but in practice, it's just keeping that identity locked away in our system. It's, in a way, keeping it alive. So if we hear new conditioning that says, sometimes these feelings just have to come out, the traumas just have to be given space to come out, and we are very scared of that because it feels so uncomfortable. It feels like it's going to kill us, in fact. It feels like we won't survive if we have to feel that trauma. And that's why we keep running away from it. We keep turning away from it. And the truth is we need to feel it. It won't kill us. It is very uncomfortable, but it won't kill us in the way we imagine it will. And if an openness sets in where those uncomfortable feelings are allowed to come up more than they were previously, a lot of insight can come from feeling the intensity of the trauma, and then your understanding of the concepts of non-doership might start being applied and seen to be what is at the very base of the trauma. The very base of the trauma might be seen to be strong attachment to outcomes, like attachment to love. When the trauma comes up, you can feel extreme sadness, for example, or grief that a parent hasn't paid attention to you, that a parent might have been aggressive to you. And in that grief, there is very clearly a craving for attention, for love, which doesn't make, the suggestion here is not to say, oh, that's very unenlightened, it shouldn't be like that. Because if we do that, we're going to be suppressing it again and invalidating it. What I'm suggesting is, if it is allowed to come up and is expressed, where we allow the sadness, the grief, the hatred, there will be hatred usually, and feel it and really see it, and it can be very strong, and we can maybe take a back seat and say, wow, that is very intense. I didn't realize there was such intensity in there. The very fact that it starts to move is a great progression. And sometimes that the inner space is so full that it needs weeks, months of that sort of seeking, that sort of movement, which is not a movement of intellectual concepts, but rather feeling in the body and allowing things to come out and be expressed. And in a way, it's a bit like purging. It's releasing. And there can be space after such a release that then allows the concepts to be something that we feel much more truly based on that space having opened up. Now, the space opening up doesn't mean that a day later you don't feel a contraction again and you don't feel more trauma. It's going to be a mix of space and trauma, maybe a lot of trauma and not so much space. But it's very valid to, as well as all the talk about just witness and see it as unreal. And it's also very valid for us to hear explanations that say, you know, you have to allow it in all of its intensity as if it is completely truthful, meaning completely validated. Not repeat the story, but allow that story to have its space.
Thank you, Roger, and I'll see the recording also. Yeah, I'll note down what you say, and thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for sharing. It's that's nice for that perspective to come in sometimes about the energetic loads, because really all of this belief in doership and attachment to outcomes, they're deeply ingrained and essentially deeply ingrained in those old experiences that have been locked away a certain way. So that's why it's so important for those energies to be embodied as well as just witnessed from an impersonal perspective. So they're two very valid, two very different movements within the spiritual seeking, and there's a time for one and then there's a time for the other. And sometimes we only hear about one, and if we only hear about one, let's say just the witnessing, then the notion of feeling these energies and allowing them in their full force can seem like ignorance or not a valid movement in a non-dual path, but I think it's very valid. So it's just a matter of allowing whichever one happens to feel more appropriate on a particular day. And that's really the journey unfolding. So I think, unless there are any other questions, we'll call it a day. Thank you, everybody. Peace.